of these supporting militaries seem not to be really clear. Are they in Africa to uphold their largely imperialist agenda on the continent, or to help struggling nations against their adversaries? France and Mali have severe ties, but quickly to get into conversation is Russia. While some foreign militaries are leaving the continent, others are also coming, seeking new partners across the continent in their various moves to hold the crux of the global conversation. As the French military leaves, Gbenga comes in, and the stories are repeated time and again. Operations like Barkhane have not pointed to great results, and African lands and borders are still being tested. The volume of humanitarian crisis on the continent is increasing, from the west to the east and the Horn of Africa, and it leaves many wondering what the decades of foreign interventions have achieved. How much help have these foreign militaries rendered, and is African security better for it?
And that's the million-dollar question. Is African security better for it? How much difference has it made? I have joining me on the program today to discuss this and more, Professor Emeritus Mukesh Kapila of the University of Manchester. He was a former United Nations senior official and the head of the United Nations mission in Sudan. I also have joining me live from New York, Natasha Lewis. She's a research director of Africa Watch at London Politica. A warm welcome to you, lady and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to start with Natasha. Africa holds an enviable, if not dubious, record of experiencing the highest number of conflicts in the world. While Africa accounted for 13% of all civil wars in the 1960s, it was host to 35% of the world's conflicts by the beginning of the 21st century. So what are the key drivers of these conflicts on the continent, and why do we hold this unenviable record?
I think the contributing factors for conflicts throughout Africa are obviously quite vast, but the majority of it obviously has a lot to do with ethnic tensions, conflicts amongst religious groups, and corruption, I would say, is the biggest contributor. I think when it comes to foreign military intervention, while there is a lot of blame to take on foreign countries, it's difficult to have a good collaboration when you have corrupt leaders.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. Now, Professor Kapila, I'd also want to have your take on that. What is it about the African continent that we see them in Western newspapers? As Africa is described as war-torn, and you have adjectives like that to describe the things that happen on this continent because of it seems to be in a permanent state of war. If you look at the continent today, you have conflicts in the Eastern DRC, in the Central African Republic, in different parts of the continent. Why is there something about Africa that is susceptible to war and conflict?
I think apart from the good points mentioned by Natasha, there is a common factor across Africa, and that is the lack of good governance. While, in other words, we have got very poor governance and public administration in many, many countries, while at the same time, globalization and exposure to the wider world has raised the aspirations of African citizens, and they expect a different deal between themselves and the governments. And when the two collide rather with each other, the result obviously is going to be a lot of conflict, which also then begins to spill over into neighboring territories.
Now, stay with you, Professor Kapila. You're a former United Nations official, senior official, and head of the United Nations mission in Sudan. When the United Nations took over from the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN, it It was said that never again will the world witness such horrors that they witnessed pre-1945. Now, the R2P, the responsibility to protect, is a global political commitment which was endorsed by all United Nations member states at the 2005 summit in order to address its four key concerns: to prevent genocide, to prevent war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. How has this been used? And the world remembers 1994 in Rwanda, just a few years ago. Why did the world look on if you had this R2P to witness the horrors of the Rwandan genocide?
I think internationally, as a community of states, we made huge progress in terms of setting norms. In other words, we got reasonable unanimity among member states that some things are really bad and they cannot be tolerated in the civilized community of nations. And so all these R2P norms have grown, and as well as instruments such as the International Criminal Court. And if you look at the African Union's statutes, they all say good stuff. The problem has been that the ability to implement the norms has not been there, either through a lack of political will or through physical capacities to actually enforce those norms. So in a sense, the norms are aspirations, and the norms are good because unless you aspire to something better, then we're not going to make any progress at all. But by and large, most people are getting more and more cynical about these declarations because R2P norms haven't protected any mass atrocity in any country in the world, let alone in Africa, which has spawned at least 3 or 4 genocides since the word was invented.
Is it the bureaucracy that prevents them from acting on time, or political interest?
Well, I think the question is, who are the duty bearers? Now, in the various international instruments which member states have signed up to, the idea is that each nation that signs up becomes a duty bearer. So in other words, if you fear genocide somewhere, then you have a duty to intervene. And the UN or regional organizations like the African Union, they have that coordinating and collectivizing capacity. But because of international politics, i.e. the politics between nations, people are unable to commit their resources or even indeed to recognize crimes against humanity. So for wider geopolitical reasons. And when that happens, then I think we see what happened in Darfur, we see what happened in Rwanda, and we're seeing what is happening in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, for example, and atrocities in Congo, and numerous other places around Africa that we all know about.
Thank you very much, Professor Kapila. I'd like to bring in Natasha in New York. Now, Natasha, let's talk about Libya. Under Gaddafi, Libya had the highest life expectancy in Africa. Now, thanks to Western military intervention, Libya is one of the most dangerous nations in the world, a haven for modern slavery, and all sorts of things are happening there. Are foreign military interventions compliant with international law, or are they a violation of African countries' sovereignty? And is there adequate planning for post-intervention state, planning for the next day?
I think overall, when, foreign interventions take place, that there might be some, good objectives with wanting to focus on human rights issues, but the truth is that their motivations are not always altruistic. And so 100%, there will always be difficulties with militaries breaking these laws. And I'm certainly not saying that that's a good thing, but things are complicated and they occur whether intentionally or not. I think that with what is developing in these situations is incredibly complex, because it's not only now one foreign entity intervening to protect, for instance, in counterterrorism, but you're having this grasp for power amongst different nations, like as an example, between the US, Russia, and China, which is just exacerbating, obviously, the effects on the ground.
Now, so how do we address this issue? Because it seems like, the different world orders for powerful nations and the different rules to it. Because Russia just unilaterally invaded Ukraine. And we've seen in the past how the United States and the United Kingdom went into Iraq, over 10 million people dead on the premise of weapons of mass destruction. No weapons of mass destructions were found, and they're still living with the effects of that. So are we in a new world order that, lesser nations will just have to fold their arms and hope that they don't get the short end of the stick? Because it seems like powerful nations would always get away with what they want to do.
I think we're inching towards a situation like that. As a lot of analysts are reporting when it comes to Africa, they're approaching this Cold War between the West, Russia, and China. And I do think, at least now, that African countries do have a say, but they should be mindful of who they're building these relationships with. I mean, you look at these, debt issues with China, or allowance of Russian and Chinese propaganda. African countries should look carefully at how these people are treating their own in their countries, but also how are Africans being treated in Russia or in China, as an example. This is a dangerous precedent to build these relationships. And while Western countries obviously don't have a great track record, it's about, I guess, picking the lesser of the evils.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And on that note, I'd like to just follow up on Natasha's commentary. Natasha said African countries need to be mindful of who they're doing business with and, who they choose to be partners in this war against terrorism. Now, over the last decade, there has been many counterterrorism interventions, including various French-led programs, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, the Multinational Joint Task Force, and the Operation Barkhane, to name a few. And also the United Nations Multidimensional Stabilization Mission in Mali. Why have they failed to stem the growing tide of violent extremist groups in these countries?
Let me give you an answer with a medical analogy reflecting my own background. When a person with a complicated condition comes in, you give them a mixture of therapies. If you just say, okay, this person has got a headache, and you just administer paracetamol without actually giving the antibiotic or whatever other support you have to give to treat their condition, well, I think these military interventions are just like that. Short-term interventions with a single tool, in this case, a military intervention to address an acute problem, whether it is counter-terroristic objectives or law and order situation on the ground, because the country is, the governance of the country is overwhelmed. And there are, as we saw in Haiti, there are even gangs running the country. Now, if you do that without actually doing all the other things that need to happen, whether it is to do development or whether it is to do democracy, whether it is to look at the grievances of the citizens, then don't be surprised that the military intervention, it doesn't matter who makes it, whether it's an African institution or a foreign ex-colonial institution, it doesn't really matter. It'll come to the same side end as it always does. And unfortunately, we are, as the international community, we are not good at multi-dimensional interventions. In other words, having interventions in a variety of sectors, all simultaneously, economic, social, military, all put in together in a coordinated manner. And this, I think, I'm not sure we're going to have an easy answer to this in the years ahead.
Now, I want to follow up with what I asked Natasha earlier, someone that is very familiar with the inner workings of the United Nations. Is the problem of, bigger countries getting away with what they want to do, is it reforming the United Nations Security Council? And do we just hope that everybody would be altruistic in the decisions they make in the future? Because you have hundreds of countries that are now members of the Security Council, and it's quite scary that you know, the big 2 or 3, 4, 5 would always get away with anything they want to do because of course, mutually assured destruction and the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
I think that, unfortunately...
Yes. Sorry, Natasha, that question is directed to Professor Kapila. I'll come back to you shortly.
My apologies.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
yes.
Actually, I was hoping Natasha would have a clever answer. I think the problem is that it's very easy to blame the Security Council for the failings of states. Now, it is true that the big powers in the Security Council, permanent powers, have a lot of interests to protect in their own particular way, and they have the capacity to do it. But quite honestly, the current situation is, and I don't speak for Russia, I don't know who can speak for Russia, but at least the other permanent powers, including China, I do not think they're in the mood to intervene anywhere at all. They've got enough domestic problems, not least economic and social problems of their own. So the idea that all these great powers are sitting there scheming away in the Security Council, trying to run the world, if only that was possible. And we might have a more peaceful, better rules-based world. And so I think it's time African countries, including very large African countries, stop using the Security Council as some kind of bogeyman to beat around with when many of the problems are due to their own misbehaviors in their own continents, be it Africa, be it elsewhere.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Natasha, are there any strengths of military intervention in African conflicts? Are there examples of, when the Blue Helmets came in, when the United States or foreign powers came in and, they got the bad guys out and, everybody was happy and lived happily ever after? Are there any examples of that? And are there any strengths of military intervention in conflicts on the continent?
I mean, thus far, I do not believe so. Because even in cases, for instance, like with Sierra Leone and the intervention of the Blue Helmets from the UN, that's kind of been their, medal of honor that they wave around of this successful intervention. And if you look at the cases that have happened with those who have been rehabilitated and what those programs consist of, or what has been left behind, such as, drug abuse, massive post-traumatic stress disorder problems, refusal to assist women who are now prostituting themselves, I would argue that that does not sound like a successful intervention to me. Now, I don't think that this means that moving forward, we should refuse to have these interventions. I just think that they need to be done better.
And how do you suggest they can be done better? Because looking at images coming out of Tigray, I mean, it's shocking that in 2022, the world would literally fold its arms when children and women are dying in their numbers. And all we see is talks here and there with little action. How better can the international community respond to conflicts on the continent?
Well, to piggyback on what was said earlier, I think that countries need to have a multi-sectoral approach. I think that's consistently lacking. And we're seeing how, you can't build security without having development and vice versa. This will contribute to a further collapse. But additionally, I'm seeing things where obviously military trainings are incredibly lacking, whether it's African participants that are within the United Nations, or as an example, the United States military has pulled back from counterinsurgency training, even though they have a history. Those are the types of conflicts that they're in the most. So I think nations, both internally in Africa and abroad, need to refocus. If these are the things that we're going to be involved in, then we should invest more time and finances into proper training.
Thank you, Natasha. Professor Kapila, we've seen the gradual withdrawal of France from Mali. I mean, it's total withdrawal. So there's this withdrawal and its EU partners from Mali signal counterterrorism fatigue, or they're not happy, they're looking at other partners? Case in point, Russia. We've also seen growing anti-French sentiment across the sub-region. How important is the French presence in fighting violent extremism in the Sahel? Because you talk to the locals there, they tell you they've been here for more than 10 years and the situation has not changed. So why not try a different partner? So you have a situation where certain African countries feel, these problems are beyond us. We either go with the West or we go with the East, but we need to find a foreign partner. Why can't African nations take care of their own security challenges?
Indeed, on the French-Mali business, I think one can understand both perspectives. I think from the French perspective, I imagine if you've been trying to do something for 10 years and banging your head against the wall, not making any progress, then it's wise to leave. From the Malian viewpoint, obviously the country remains as poor and unstable now as it has been before. If anything, military interventions of all sorts, internal and external, have created further instability. So the only thing we can say is that this has taught us is that military intervention may occasionally buy some temporary respite for putting other more important interventions in place, whether they're economic or creating human security in its wider definition of the term. When that doesn't happen, then I think military interventions, people should go in and out as fast as possible if they have to. Now, as far as African Union is concerned and more domestic interventions, I don't think they're qualitatively any different than, say, Western interventions in Africa, because the issues and principles are the same. But there is one issue, and I'll pick up on a point alluded to by Natasha, and that is that the quality of the troops that other countries deploy in their military peace interventions is extremely important. When the peacekeepers start behaving as badly as the different acronyms that are fighting each other on the ground, then you become part of the problem. And the quality of the interventions and the proper support and capacitation of the military contingents on the ground, in my experience of observation, have often meant that even a well thought of intervention often isn't allowed to succeed. It's just not properly supported.
If you don't have the quality personnel, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a fine place to go on a break. If you're just joining, you're watching Secure the Continent, a News Central Television. We'll go on a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion on foreign military interventions in Africa. How successful have they been? Do stay with us. We'll be right back after this break. If you're just joining us, this is Secure the Continent, News Central Television, and we've been discussing foreign military interventions on the African continent. Have they been successful or not? And joining me to discuss this from Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, we have Professor Emeritus Mukesh Kapila of the University of Manchester and a former senior United Nations official. I also have joining me from New York, Natasha Luis, a research director of Africa Watch at London Politica in New York. Welcome back to the conversation. Now, I would like to pick up with Natasha. Looking at solutions, African solutions to African problems has been mooted for quite a while. Now, the African Union Standby Force, the idea behind it was mooted 20 years ago. Now, what's the role and mandate of this African Standby Force in African security? Is the ASF an adequate conflict response mechanism? They're looking at it like, instead of inviting, foreign countries to come intervene in our own affairs or the United Nations, we just donate, soldiers from different African countries and we take care of our own problems. What do you make of this?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but it does bear its own complications, because when you look at, for instance, what's going on throughout these places where the ASF or, the UN, who are comprised of different nations, it does build tensions where you have Kenyans not wanting Ethiopians or vice versa. And, certain people who have these rivalries will then commit these, additional human rights abuses that we were discussing earlier. So I do think Africans have the capabilities to solve their own issues, but I do think it's best to do it possibly collaboratively or be very conscientious of who you're inviting to where.
And also learn from the pitfalls of other foreign military interventions on the continent, I believe. Now, Professor Kapila, as we speak, M23 rebels in eastern DRC closing in Goma. They've said they're not going to negotiate and they're not signing any peace agreement. You've been in this sort of situation before as the head of the United Nations mission in Darfur. MONUSCO is the world's second largest UN mission with approximately 16,000 military personnel and police officers. MONUSCO has been in the Congo for over 20 years and can't seem to end the conflict in the east. People are getting massacred and killed under the UN's watch. Some see MONUSCO as accomplices of the misfortune. Why hasn't MONUSCO been successful in the DRC, and how do you get out of this sort of conundrum?
Well, in the case of the Congo, a region I knew well when I was dealing with Rwanda, the problem is part conceptual and part physical. It would require a huge superpower army in place in a region as vast as the Eastern DRC to actually have any meaningful impact on security on a day-to-day basis in a consistent manner. And clearly, MONUSCO does not and cannot have that. And the other problem has been conceptual. Many years have passed, the region has changed, the continent has changed, but the objectives of MONUSCO don't necessarily seem to have kept pace with the changing dynamics. So in that sense, it's got an impossible job. And it just makes a general point that when people are not, when fighting groups are not ready to make peace, no force on earth is going to force them to make that peace, especially if the force is under strength and under supported and under politically led. Now, what's the solution? I think, I have, after my experiences in Rwanda, Sudan, and many other places, have moderated my own kind of ambitions. Nowadays, as I deal, for example, in relation to Tigray and Ethiopia, I've come to understand that when people have grievances against each other, they are going to fight each other. I would prefer they didn't, but they're going to. And no amount of diplomacy is going to work if they're really determined and the grievances are really deep. But what we can do is to build capacity so people fight each other without committing atrocities on each other. In other words, is it not possible to argue out your differences, whether on the battlefield or in talking to each other, without committing huge abuses upon each other? The reason this is important is that eventually the quality of the peace that comes, and eventually there will be peace, even if it is not in my lifetime, it'll depend on how brutal the war was. So I think what African Union, the UN should be doing now is, it sounds very perverse for me to say so, is actually enhancing the capability of people to fight wars in a way that it doesn't commit these abuses all the time. So this is, I'm not saying I'm pro-war or anything like that, don't misunderstand me, but I really think we should be confronting atrocities and human rights abuses in the conduct of war rather than questions of war and peace.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Natasha, in recent years, there's been a surge in the presence of foreign militaries in Africa. If you look at a country like Djibouti, even the Japanese that have a pacifist constitution have a base in Djibouti. The Chinese have, everybody wants a peace. It's not just militaries present. The US Africa Command is also present. In Africa, you have the Russian Wagner Group and Russian advisors in the west of the continent and in Central African Republic. Is Africa now the playground for, the global geopolitical interests? Why are there so many foreign militaries present on the continent?
Yes, I do believe that Africa is becoming a geopolitical playground. We're seeing this, with worries in Washington about China building secret military bases, like there's one established in Djibouti, but rumors of one in Ghana or Equatorial Guinea. And I think that this, will increase tensions amongst these countries, especially should someone have a power play and block trade routes or whatever. And unfortunately, Africa is going to be the one to suffer the consequences. And we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, these propaganda machines expanding, more presence on the ground expanding. So it definitely will continue to increase, especially when we're considering a grab for resources, whether it's things that go into electronics or nuclear weapons or also oil.
Thank you, Natasha. Professor Kapila, some aid groups believe that a largely militarized response to violent extremism could provoke retaliatory attacks. Can military interventions be avoided by better mechanisms of conflict resolutions? And what sort of mechanisms do you offer? Because you can't outsource governance of a country to another foreign country. That's why they got independence in the first time. And they always request for this foreign military intervention when things have gone really, really bad and out of hand. So what other mechanisms can be used?
I think conflict resolution remains extremely important. And obviously at the heart of it is diplomacy. But what is important is that conflict resolution is seen to be impartial as far as the protagonists are concerned. And the problem we've had is a lack of trust in the sponsoring institutions, whether it's the UN because of the geopolitics we've already talked about, or in regional organizations, the same issues apply at the regional level. And so how to build trust so that the protagonists have confidence in the good offices of the negotiators is something that takes years of confidence building and can't be easily done. The other thing also is that there have to be some gains and peace dividends to the protagonists. So in the conflict resolution that I have seen work better than others, what has happened is there have been quick returns. In other words, people could see some benefit almost immediately, and that reinforced what was to happen afterwards. Thirdly, I think justice cannot be ignored in this. Conflict resolution and peace building without a justice track to address the terrible things that have happened during the conduct of the war, I was speaking earlier, those peace agreements unfortunately always break down. So accountability and finding a measure of accountability that is acceptable to local people is an extremely important part of that resolution of the conflict.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Still, I want to take you on this. I asked Natasha earlier about the African Union's standby force. The AU's aspiration is that the ASF, the African Standby Force, will free the continent of the need of non-African outside forces for conflict resolution. Is this an achievable aim for the AU, or is it just utopian?
Oh, it's achievable if enough African countries put enough good quality troops. Of course, in reality, as we know from the European experience of, there's a European Union force of some sort, or at least a try, that you can't just have a bunch of soldiers sitting around in some cantonment in some country waiting to be deployed. So effectively what a standby force means is a commitment by member states to provide certain capacities, logistical, fighting, aviation, medical, and so on and so forth. And they can come together under central command and control and be deployed. So a number of problems. One, what's the cost of this and who's going to bear the cost? Secondly, can African nations agree to centralized command and control whenever such a standby force is deployed? We know from experience in other theaters, in Bosnia and so on, it's very, very difficult. states don't want to cede control of their own contingents. And I saw this for myself in ECO-MOG and ECOWAS when I was dealing with Sierra Leone and Liberia. We had a force of number of member states from West Africa, but the orders from the Central Command had to be second-guessed by the commanders of the headquarters of the other contributing nations. So I think that again calls for trust building before people will give their own military under the command of, say, someone in Addis.
Okay. Now, Natasha, how can the involvement of Western countries become more beneficial to the continent's peace-seeking agenda?
Well, I think that, they need to be more considerate of, first of all, like their training, like I said earlier. Moving away from counterinsurgency training is a huge mistake, as that is the conflicts that we are involved in the most. Additionally, I think we need to be more conscientious of having this multi-sectoral approach where we're more involved with civil societies. We're trying to build our international relations ahead of time. Western countries, when dealing with military conflicts, tend to be more reactive than proactive. And I think if we try to step forward and be more proactive, establishing our relationships more as a core interest, I think that could help prevent these situations that tend to fall apart in the future.
Thank you, Natasha. Still staying with you, Natasha, do you also think that Western countries perhaps might not want to wield the big stick? And I'll come to the reason why I'm saying this shortly, because of business or geopolitical interest in some situation. Let's look at the current example of the DRC. I mean, it's obvious, and the United Nations has brought out evidence. Multiple parties have said, Rwanda is guilty of arming the M23 rebels. They're actually sponsoring the M23 rebels that leads to a lot of destabilization in eastern DRC. But you have the French that know this, but they're very careful about the way they treat Rwanda, because Rwanda is helping them secure Cabo Delgado. You have a multi-billion-dollar gas project there. And on the other hand, you also have the British government, which is planning to have a Rwanda deal, and they give millions of pounds in aid to Rwanda. So they are very careful with what they do. But while they sit aside and not make decisive decisions, people are dying. There's a lot of displacement. So how do they walk around this eggshells?
I mean, I think the problem is looking back on our, the Western history of involvement in Africa it has not worked out well at all. If you look at the US and Somalia, or obviously the French in Mali, that's been going on, they've had devastating hits to their own troops. And back home, civilians don't want to support involvement, especially since, in the general public, people don't understand why it is crucial to be involved with Africa, hopefully in a better context. So I think that these situations in the past have caused people to be incredibly cautious of if they should be involved or how they should be involved. And unfortunately, as you said, people are dying, and this is catastrophic. We saw this in Rwanda, where there was no response at all, and this is going to continue. And then once again, eventually, Western forces will likely be involved, whether it is through military intervention or whether it's aid, and it's going to be more costly to lives and financial.
Thank you, Natasha. Professor Kapila, the final question and the toughest and the million-dollar question of this evening. So you have a situation where, countries have interest and geopolitical interest and what have you. And the United Nations mission in Congo, as an example, have not been able to end this conflict. So can you sketch us a path out of conflicts on this continent and in Africa, and do military interventions really work?
Well, I think the kind of ideal path out of such situations is to have time and patience. And in other words, anyone who wishes to engage needs to be in it for the permanent whole. That's one thing. The second thing is that it has got to be multidimensional. And thirdly, it can't go against local sentiment. So what that means is that the interests of the people and the country that is at the center of the crisis, whether it's Congo or whether it's anywhere else, Ethiopia, for example, they have to be at the center of trying to find solutions. And that, in my opinion, means that, yes, there is a role for military intervention, but that role is very limited, very short-term, for very precise elements in it. And beyond that, be ready to engage on the economic, social, and political front, and reform global institutions, reform the UN, reform the African Union, to find a vehicle for better cooperation among nations.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukesh Kapila and Natasha Louis. Thank you very much for being a part of today's Secure the Continent. I do appreciate your time, insights, and contributions to the program. Thank you.
Thank you.